So, welcome to our panel. I'm trying to test out, I think this sounds good, right? Yeah, okay. To our panel, practical versus exemplary sustainability, their right way to archive email. This is a very trick question, so we're hoping to answer it. Like they said, my name is Ruby Martinez, and I'm a moderator of the debate style session. I use that in quotation marks because debate implies that there's going to be a winner. There's no winning for this kind of session. Many of you are joining us today, probably in different stages of your email archiving journey, and email archiving served as my introduction into digital preservation, and I often describe this as it felt very much like a can of worms, you know. I know, clicker. So if you search can of worms on Google, this is the first thing that you'll see. If you say that someone is opening a can of worms, you're waiting for them, warning them that they are planning to do or talk about something which is much more complicated, unpleasant, or difficult than they realize, and which might be better left alone. This is not the instance for email. Email is not better left alone, and I'm sure that you'll know that after the session. And if you take anything from the session, hopefully it's just that you are more comfortable having these conversations with each other, with us, with your institutions. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this model, good, fast, cheap. You can only pick two. If you're not familiar with it, I forgot to include the citation, so I'll make sure to do that next time. But for this context, it's you choose to, whether in the context of email preservation, it's you either do a fast project or a good fast and good project, or you do a cheap and fast project, or you can do a good and cheap project. And it's all for additional context, fast refers to the time of delivery, cheap refers to the cost, and good refers to the scope and the features of where you want this project to go. So all three cannot be optimized without impacting quality, which is very important. And, sorry, which is very important, and you have to choose, which one you can be flexible with. So let's say you have the time and resources to undertake a cheap but fast project. So this project is most likely going to be good at meeting your current needs, but the chances of it being able to adapt over time is very limited. And now with your fast and good, this requires more resources and definitely more money to be able to pull something like this off. So you're talking like dedicated project staff, technical resources, and good and cheap. These are projects that take the most time, projects that are often left in the back burner. You get to it when you can, but those generally turn out a little bit better. So, email archiving. I don't know how this sand background got on my slides. This has not been there. So, yeah, I guess it's implying whatever. It's not implying anything. I don't want to be at a beach. I want to be here in Glasgow. But first, I'd like to provide some framing for this discussion. So we have this spectrum where practical is on one end and exemplary is on the other. So we look at email archiving as a spectrum, where one end of the spectrum we see projects that are considered practical with lower barriers of entry. These options use proprietary software most of the time, may not be scalable beyond your institution. And on the other end of the spectrum, live projects that are quite complex and require significant and technical support via dedicated staff, software integrations, which represent exemplary projects. So on one end, you'll have Chris's project, and then on the other, you'll have Cal's project, you'll hear more about as we get through this discussion. So where does this one-size-fits-all approach fit into the spectrum? Really, it doesn't with the current email archiving landscape. Email archiving is still a relatively new field, meaning tools are actively being refined, projects are being expanded, and new tools are being introduced over time. And the network continues to expand with projects aiming to fill these known gaps. So the good news is there's more been more projects thinking beyond the solutions of their own institutions and how to scale that and bring more people into the community. So the expansion of the EA network, I really love the sand. I don't know how this happened. So the last 2 years have seen increased interest by researchers in digital preservation and efforts to address some known challenges. So part of the email archive building capacity and community re-grant program is responsible for a lot of the projects that you're going to hear about later, and it's a project that I coordinate with Chris. So this represents a growing network of numerous professionals in the archival, library, digital preservation, and museum fields that develop and address critically needed solutions to preserving email. For the sake of time, I challenged myself to summarize these projects in one sentence, and I want Cal and Chris to get ready because they're also going to have this challenge too to describe their own projects, but I'll go first to give them some time. So out of Harvard University, we have ePad Plus, the refinement of ePad, adding preservation functionality into widely used tool in the community, the attachment converter outside of the University of Chicago Library, takes a look at attachments and builds a command line tool to batch convert attachments in email collections to recommended preservation formats. Mailbag out of the special collections and archives there at the University of Albany. That's one of the first projects that have been completed and finished, so I urge you to check out their specification. That's not my sentence, though. My sentence is they created a mailbag functional specification based on the baggage specification tool to create and manage packages of email archiving using multiple formats. So this is intended to help archivists rapidly make email archive stable and ensure that they remain useful over time. And then you have the COVID-19 corpus outside of Columbia University. So this project is focused on government responses to the pandemic that are released through Freedom of Information Act requests made available online by journalists. So this project, these emails are technically made available via PDF. So their tool kind of migrating these PDF files that they get into Mbox files output to be compatible with current email archiving solutions. And the Council of State Archivists are developing and delivering capacity building activities across state and territorial archives. And CONDIS, which is outside of the University of Maryland, is looking how researchers interact with email archives and focuses on the discovering access part of the email lifecycle. The 92Y partnered with Stanford University Libraries to assess and preserve their email archive, but also to develop a framework for other cultural institutions to undertake their own journeys. So with these projects, you're starting to begin seeing intersections with other communities and other disciplines, which is a wonderful outcome out of the EABCC. And so who likes to go first? Chris, do you want to do your one sentence bit of your project?
Sure thing, Ruby, I'd be happy to. And I just want to do a mic check here as well. Okay, so I'm going to try, because I'm in Scotland, to use some slang. So I don't know if William or anybody else is here, but I'm going to say my project is a totally doolally work thing that just might work, which is crazy. It's a totally bonkers project that just might work, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Okay, so Cal.
Okay, I have no special words. I was just going to say that, yeah, the Raytom Fire, which is the project I'll talk a little bit about, has developed open source software to better enable email curation pipelines, basically is what I would say.
Thank you. I didn't hear any of that because technical difficulties right here.
Yeah.
You only missed 2 sentences.
Yeah, you know it already, so.
Yeah. The mouse disappeared. Okay, we got it.
It's weird that it scrambled it like that. I've never seen that before.
What is it?
Yeah, we were not right here. So right here, this, where did the project converge? It's okay. 2 seconds away. I think you can just start it from the beginning, and I'll just keep going. Yeah, okay. Does the clicker still work? Oh, yes, okay. So where do these projects converge? So last year, Chris and I did a survey trying to assess the needs of Illinois and their current practices. One of the questions we had the other comments, so they can feel free to complain about all the things that they've encountered in email archiving. And so, some of these comments here address issues that also came up in the workshop that Sally and Tricia gave for EPAD. But things like that there needs to be dedicated staff, institutional buy-in, how embargo periods affect when you're going to actually start archiving email. So we're hoping that with these projects, you'll see some of these needs getting addressed and having a more community direction, I guess you could say, on how to tackle these specific issues and get institutional buy-in and try to just lift up your email archiving program off the ground. And a lot of that just starts with having a conversation, which is something that we're going to do today. So with that, we're going to start with our first debate question that I'm going to pose to Cal and Chris. What is your take on the current email archiving landscape, and how does your project fit in? Whoever wants to go first. We don't have a magic buzzer.
I'll let you go.
Sure. So I would say, there has been a lot of progress in ways that we've already heard over the past few years, but as Tricia Patterson pointed out yesterday in one of the sessions, we've had email for a long time, right? Many people in this room aren't as old as email, right? So I think that as much as we're going to, I should be using the mic. As much as we're going to talk about various technical approaches, as was reflected also in that earlier session about email, a lot of the issues, of course, are institutional and recognition of the need to kind of deal with the email, right? Which is, I don't know. I think it would be shocking to somebody outside our profession to realize how new we are in enabling ourselves to deal with email, given that it's been around for 51 years. But yeah, there's been a lot of activity and a lot more sort of tools that enable us to do the work. But I think that probably many would agree that a lot of the persistent issues are institutional ones in terms of not recognizing as a priority, still having this notion that I thought we got over in the 90s or something, that like email is my own personal property and it doesn't belong to the institution, all those sorts of things. But
Yeah, but Cal, how does your project fit in?
oh, I'm sorry, how does our project fit in? It's a tool. We decided we just needed software to solve the problem. Yeah, no, so it fits in by being open source software that, as I said, is kind of designed to support digital curation pipelines. The project, the original project was called RayTom, a nod to Ray Tomlinson, who kind of arguably invented email, though that's always debatable about whether somebody invented something. And it was funded by the Mellon Foundation, so this was kind of work that came before, and the idea was to develop basically two sets of tools, one that were much more like command line tools and things that you can kind of feed through a pipeline, and then another that was a web tool that allows you to make decisions based on tags and natural language processing that's been run in the background. And so, sorry to be sort of turning my head, but this is where we have the screen. So what we did specifically in RayTom Fire, you've heard that there was this re-grant, initiative that we were part of. We got one of the grants from it. Was to specifically address some needs that had been conveyed to us. One is export of email messages as individual email files. We essentially kind of write everything out to a database and hadn't originally had that as functionality. Capturing more detailed preservation metadata and expanding the API for easier integration into other tools. So that was a big part of what we were trying to emphasize.
Okay, actually, I don't need that. I think I have this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Too many mics.
So I agree with Cal. I mean, this is an issue where we really, as a community, have not made as much progress as others would expect us to, for exactly the reasons Cal noted, the lack of institutional buy-in and support. So the project that I'm going to talk about is actually something called PDF Mail, which I'm going to confess, when I heard about it for the first time, I thought was a totally bonkers idea. In fact, I remember reading it in the draft of the report on the slide here, on the left, the red one, and thinking, this is nuts. Why would you ever want to convert an email message into a PDF document? And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. We wrote the report. The Mellon Foundation funded this report. Now we have to do something about it because actually the Mellon Foundation liked it a lot. And the more we thought about it, the more sense it made in certain circumstances. And that's the key thing, the in certain circumstances part of it. So it did come out of this report. I would just like to kind of summarize very briefly that as a phase one of this project, which the Mellon Foundation funded, we all met in the Library of Congress, or a group of us met in the Library of Congress, and essentially articulated the rationale for this new file format called what we're now calling PDF Mail. Last year, we had actually reported on this at the iPres 2022 meeting, but as part of that work, and by that I mean mainly Ruby, administered a poll to ask what is the current state of email archiving. We wanted to know just from a small sample, so we turned to our own state, which is Illinois, and surveyed all collecting repositories. And you can kind of see from that most of them really aren't doing anything. Or if they are, it's at a very low level of support. I'm not going to tell you which category my own institution is in here, but it's not one of the bigger pieces of the pie, unfortunately, because we have a lot of email, but we're still coming up with plans for it. So here's another example. We do surveys when we go out and do workshops with groups that are already interested in doing email preservation. They're getting some email preservation training, and you can see they have a little bit more activity going on, but again, not as much as you would expect within the community. So there's a lot of reasons for that. I think Cal had already indicated some of these: lack of institutional buy-in, lack of technical training, lack of technology solutions. So interesting thing in doing this poll, actually 8 of the institutions mentioned that they were already using PDF to archive their emails. This was just a free text question we had put on the poll. We really weren't expecting to see that, but they said, hey, this is what we're using because it's available. It's a technology that we already use in our repository infrastructure, and why not, kind of build on that? So that was kind of the genesis of the PDF Mail project, and it's really to meet a need that's out there, complementary to things like what Raytom, Fire, and EPAD are doing. It's not to be replacing in any sense, it's to be complementing. And really what it is an attempt to standardize email metadata in PDF format in a way that preserves its evidential value and preserves its recordness. So that's a little bit about the project and the genesis and why we're doing what we are. So.
Yes, and so because you've been so successful in obtaining those grants for your email archiving programs, can you tell us a bit about your design decisions behind those programs? And Cal, I believe you're first.
I think I'll try to use the mic. So just very briefly, what we've really tried to do, and this is very much reflected from the development team that we've had at UNC of other projects like BitCurator and BitCurator Access and NLP and things that people might have been familiar with, is that we've really tried to develop the software to be sort of modular and not sticky, and that you don't have to sit inside the environment. It writes out data into a relatively simple SQLite database that then can be piped into other places. And so essentially, we pull stuff out of PST files. That's a big part of actually what the original work was, right? It's kind of a grubby thing that you don't want to have to do, but there really wasn't an open source tool out there. I mean, essentially we use libpff, which is it comes from the digital forensics world, and it's quite useful, but we sort of, packaged it in a way that made it more useful for our purposes. Spacey, you see up there in the top right corner, is for doing named entity recognition. So the idea is essentially, how do we enable people to sort of do this markup, do these kinds of decisions based on running through this pipeline. Sorry, oh wow. Okay, completely unreadable, but no sand. Okay, sorry about the image. I mean, this is all done. If you go to GitHub, where our software is, you can see this image in an actual readable form. But this is just basically the table structure of what gets written out, right? And so one thing that we've developed is more metadata, basically based on sort of processing information that people using the software wanted us to add. So here you see it in a little bit more detail, right? Originating file metadata, extracted entity instances, so by entity I mean people, places, organizations, the sort of things that Spacey, which is this pretty powerful NLP tool, does. Message metadata can optionally include the message body, but of course, I mean, that's something we might discuss when we're talking about sort of, strategies, is whenever you get into bodies of messages, there's more volume, and of course, once you start doing attachments, there's going to be a lot more. Anything that you're cranking through, like Spacey, is going to take a lot longer. Extracted header feeds and values, and then attachment metadata, right, and the potential to sort of export the email and the attachments. And so, let's see, was that all? I think that's all I had. Oh, the final thing is just to give you an idea of the output, right? That if you're running Spacey, for example, you would see, this is identifying, for example, Department of Environmental Protection. It's saying that it's an organization and telling you where it found it and what the offset is, right? What file was it in and where was it found? And so this is not, of course, intended to be sort of humanly used. It's very easy to pipe this into other tools. And so essentially, I'm sure I'm, as my grandfather would say, beating a dead horse here, right? That essentially a big part of our design decisions were around how do we enable people to just output this data in a way that can be useful for other tools, whether that's natural language processing or pushing into a repository, rather than trying to develop a self-contained environment that people have to kind of work in consistently over time.
So one of the reasons you were awarded a grant.
Well, cool. Glad to hear it. Okay, so that was it for me.
Yeah, thanks, Cal. So Ruby, your question about design decision is actually great opportunity for me to talk about phase 2 of our project and the one we're currently engaged in. I actually came here directly from a meeting of the PDF Association in Germany, where I was presenting on this topic and sitting side by side with people that are part of that trade association, trade nonprofit, whose primary focus is to develop PDF as an open standard. That's the core mission of the organization. It's really wonderful to be at that table. So we are in phase 2 of a project. This is funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is a U.S. federal agency, and is a partnership between the University of Illinois Library and the PDF Association. So the project has essentially 3 goals. First is simple collaboration. It's to be at the table with members of industry, members of the PDF community, and help them to understand what our needs are and help us to understand ways that they can better meet those needs. And that's just been a wonderful thing. We had a wonderful first meeting in the Library of Congress back in, Kate, 2019? I think it was right before the pandemic started. And since then, we've been working together online. And so it's an academic industry partnership, and it's really aimed at putting together a detailed specification for what a PDF mail format would look like and how it would meet archival needs to preserve authentic, fixed records that can be reused, just to be blunt. And then the second part of it, or the other part of it, is to build an open source tool, which the University of Illinois is developing as a proof of concept to show what these files would look like. So those are the essential goals of the project. If you print an email message out right now from one of your email clients, you're gonna get something that looks pretty good. This is Google, export of a mail, and you can see it's got an attachment there. There's some problems with this. The attachment's probably not going to be included. For starters, it may or may not be. Links may or may not be active. But behind the scenes, all of the metadata is lost, right? And this is what a lot of institutions are doing. They're printing their emails out as PDFs and they're saving them. And they're losing a lot along the way. So this project's really intended to address that point. You can think of this as a way of taking a very flexible, fluid set of records that are in a system somewhere and fixing them into a format that's preservable and that can play with existing repository architectures and that can also play with existing systems such as EPAD, such as RATOM Fire, such as other formats. We see this as a dissemination format. We don't necessarily see it as the preservation format, the end-all, be-all, but it's something that is a method that can be used within existing within other systems. So I'm going to get a little technical here. This is a slide from Peter Wyatt, who's the Chief Technology Officer at the PDF Association. We've been spending about a year now in conversations with a group of archivists and a group of developers in PDF world, including people from Adobe, from Foxit, from Callus Software, a bunch of other places. And what Peter's come up with is really interesting. I mean, he has a deep understanding of PDF as a technology, fully aware that PDF is used, abused, used incorrectly, that people don't use the file format well, and that they get blamed for that frequently. But that if there's a good spec to develop around, the community can do that, because essentially what PDF is just an open file format for shoving all kinds of textual information into it and then rendering it in a way that's intended to be preservable and accessible. So a couple of important things here. The file format would include all of the header metadata from an email message written into XMP, which is an XML-based preservation friendly format. There'd be a namespace for this called PDF mail. We would also embed the raw EML messages in it, so you can always get the EML back out again if you need to. And then there would be also associated files, which would be the attachments, images, and other things that are there. We would also build in some navigational aids using outlining and other bookmarking and things like that that are built into PDF. Out of the box, these files would be renderable using Adobe Acrobat or whatever your software is. But there's also the possibility, and this would be a phase 3 project, for a viewer application that would take full advantage of the functionality that's being built into the file. The hope is that we'd end up with something like this, a PDF viewer application that would replicate the experience that a user gets when using an email client. So on the left-hand side, you'd have a context menu that would show you the position of that message within a foldering system. On the top, you'd have EA PDF metadata viewed and maybe a set of all messages that meet your search or filter criteria. And then down below, you'd have the actual PDF mail compliant file. So that's the hope, that's the dream. We have vendors that are interested. I was sitting next to a guy at the table at lunch the other day who just received $150 million in venture capital. He's very interested in developing things that meet this file format. So we have an opportunity to be at the table with this association. It's not just PDFA. I also found out at this meeting there's an organization that almost every major content provider of is called C2PA. Have you ever heard of C2PA? Coalition for Content, Provenance, and Authenticity. If we are not at that table, what are we doing? You've got the New York Times there, you've got Google, you've got everybody. We need to be at that table. We can be at that table. They want us at that table. So that's my project. You can see I'm a little passionate about it. Totally bonkers, PDF, email, but it opened up something that I think this community can really be part of and should be part of.
And I would just add to what you were saying, Chris, that because also, I mean, I was involved in that project, went to the meeting and Library of Congress and everything, but I was also very, very skeptical of it. And one of the most convincing things to me was people from institutions such as the National Archives in the US basically saying, we're getting PDF, it sucks, we want to get better PDF, right? It's not like they're going out and telling everybody, here's how you should preserve your email. It's, if you're in an environment where you're getting it, how do we make the specifications so that it's not so awful, right?
Right, exactly.
Because the default PDF could be stuff that's just a preservation nightmare, and not just preservation, but like, how do you actually make it more like data that you can interact with, right? Which is part of the idea of how to do this with PDF. But anyway, just to add that I'm also in that crowd of not seeing this as the solution for everything, but it does have a use case that's super important. So.
Okay, so our final question before we open up, what are your plans for sustaining your work after your grant funding ends? Chris, I know you mentioned phase 3, how you...
Yes, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but we do have a bunch of partners involved in phase 2, so these are the groups that are helping us define the spec, and yeah, I'm hoping to write another grant, essentially. I think to build this viewer application, frankly, we'd have to go after NSF funding or something that's a little bit more robust than what IMLS can fund, because it's probably a $2 to $3 million project, but you've got to dream big, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. As I did say, vendors are interested in this too, so yeah.
How about you, Cal?
Well, I mean, I guess there are two parts of it. One is, you know, the software's in GitHub, it's open source, it's
Your mic.
I'm sorry, the mic. So, I mean, the software is, you know, sort of freely available and will be out there. In terms of sustaining it, I mean, the reality is the community around it has to kind of, you know,
Step up.
care and support it enough, and obviously future grants, all these activities that we've been talking about, I mean, there's always possibility. I mean, fire in the Raytime Fire was just, we're extending and enhancing it, right? So it was a follow-on grant to the original work, so. You know, there are users of the software, and I guess another part of it is also we were in partnership in the original Raytom work with the state archives in North Carolina, so, you know, the archives of our state government, and they are using, we developed that web interface very much to address their needs, and so that's part of the sustainability is institutions like them being committed enough to using it that then they'll help to sustain it, right, because that's how software gets sustained.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess now it's time to open it up for questions.
Hi. Yeah, it's working. We talk about email archiving. If you type that into Google, you will find tens, if not hundreds, of products that do email archiving. You know, you've got Proofpoint, you've got Mimecast, you've got Barracuda. There's loads. Yeah. So probably an observation is we should talk about email preservation. To distinguish email preservation, to talk about long-term retention of emails rather than archiving. But those products, you can just go and buy one. And what we're doing in Preservica is trying to link into the source of the email to use retention labels to automatically transfer things for preservation. So what is the work you've been describing, what does that do that those off-the-shelf products don't do? Where's the gap that you're feeling?
I mean, I guess I'll answer for our work first. I mean, one thing is that it's free and open source. Another thing is that it is designed specifically for the sort of the output that can feed into other pipelines, right? Can feed into the kinds of systems that people are using in cultural institutions as opposed to the way the other tools work. When I say free and open source, I mean, it's not just that, oh, now you don't have to pay to download the software. It's that, we talked about this, again, in the EPAD, the email session that was earlier in the conference, is that if you don't know how the software works, you have no idea whether it worked, right? And so there's a lot of commercial software that you can get and crank your email through it. But if you don't actually know, you don't have the ability to actually reference how well it's working, right? So I think we need these sort of tools that we can actually run through those processes in a way that we can actually know what's going in and what's coming out, right? And I mean, obviously, like the web interface that I was talking about, it's very specifically designed for the way they do work in the state archives that it was developed for, right? So you pull the email in, it has these tags already applied from the natural language processing, then you can go through and say, these ones are records, these ones are not records, these ones I've processed already, these ones I haven't processed. And so, I mean, it's not magic, it's just an interface that's designed much more for the use cases of an archivist as opposed to, like a lot of the products you're talking about also are like enterprise systems, right? And I think that's also two distinct situations that libraries and archives often end up in. And one is the need to, as you've said, John, push it into the enterprise environment. That's what you want, right? Is it just sits behind whatever you're doing with your email. But the reality of so much email that comes to institutions is like it's a PST file just sitting on a disk or something, right? And so then that processing can't go back to the original server and pull it off and do all these things we'd want to do, right? And so they're different scenarios. I mean, if somebody had the resources, I would say absolutely invest in the sort of enterprise solution where it's sitting there on the back end and you're just doing email to do email, right? But the reality is a lot of email that institutions are dealing with is sort of, it's been dumped somewhere as Mbox, PST, or whatever, and then they have to process it, right? So that was kind of a very long-winded answer to the question. But.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that, John, would be somewhat similar to Cal's in that most of those enterprise solutions really are aimed at, well, honestly, they kind of abuse the word archiving, right? I mean, we could try to reclaim it, but really what they're talking about is legal retention. They're talking about preserving things in a way that meets, whatever Sarbanes-Oxley requirements they have or whatever Freedom of Information Act requirements they have. My colleague at Illinois, Joanne, had looked at some of those tools, which, by the way, are quite pricey and expensive. A lot of them, what they do is they sit between the sender and the recipient and the server, and they capture a stream of everything taking place, which is great for provenance and authenticity, but there really isn't a good pathway to get from that point into a cultural heritage repository, because that's just not their function. So I guess just to relate my project, I was actually really interested in what you had to say at the lightning talk yesterday about Preservica's ability to ingest these large email collections, because I wasn't aware of it. I think what we're trying to do is complementary to that, both because not everybody, as you well know, is going to use Preservica or some solution like that, but also because this could also be another type of preservation object. Or I could see, for example, Preservica or some of the other systems building out richer viewing interfaces using the spec or associated open source tooling that might emerge from it. So I think there's just a lot of complementarity to all of this.
And I guess I would say also just adding to that, I see some parallel to the work that we've done previously on the BitCurator environment that has the consortium and everything around it, is that we originally pulled a lot of open source tools from the digital forensics kind of industry and pulled them in. And one of the things that is so distinct about sort of our community, if I can use that, is that we're super obsessed with metadata, right? And it just made me think when Chris was talking about that in terms of a lot of the tools that are for sort of enterprise email stuff, even if they're dealing with individual PST files or something, it's usually because there's a legal scenario, right, where you sort of present the records to somebody as opposed to I care about the metadata because I'm feeding it into some system that needs to be described in a certain way and cared for over time, right? So it's just, like, I think that's the orientation of a lot of these, whether it's EPAD or RATOM or any of these kind of tools. We focus a whole lot more on the output and how it could be pulled into another system than what the larger industry tends to be doing, right? Which is, and I agree with Chris that it's very exciting to hear about integration between, like Office 365 and a preservation environment, because that's the kind of stuff we want, right?
Right.
We just need to, again, work in these parallel directions, because some of it is whatever garbage we get, and the other is trying to push into the production environment to make sure that it gets captured. I mean, that's been sort of the aspiration since the 80s or something, right? Is that electronic records should be done in the environment where people are creating it, but we don't always have that liberty, right? Especially in sort of what we call in the US manuscript collections, right? I mean, things that come to you as like somebody's individual donation.
There's some more questions online I'd like to squeeze in before we run out of time, if that's okay. So one directed at Chris. Does the email PDF specification include a requirement to specify in the file the software, including version, that should be used to interact with the PDF? And if not, could it?
Yeah, there'll be a software declaration at the top of it that says what type of file format it is, if I understand the question
so they're
correctly.
particularly just not the authoring PDF software, but the recipient
Well, right
PDF
there, I mean,
software.
right now that's a little perspective because there isn't any authoring software for the PDF creator files, but yeah, I think we could cover that. I could actually take that feedback back to the team because we're looking to have a draft version of the spec for comment in within the working group within about 2 to 3 weeks, and then within a month or two out in the community. So yeah, I'll make a note of that point, but that's a good point.
Cool. And there's a follow-up I think is related. So will there be a PDF email format signature that will allow for identification through tools like Droid?
Yes.
And I'm going to strengthen that. I'm going to strengthen that slightly. Will you submit one, please?
Yes, I would say yes. Please have this person, if you're listening, please reach out to me and we can talk more because that's a great idea. So.
Cool. And I think we have a couple of minutes left. So this is good because I came across this today. I was trying to get the text out of an official PDF from this conference, and all the ligatures had disappeared. They'd all been swallowed. The TIs and the TTs had all been swallowed up. So there are a number of accessibility concerns that come up when preserving emails as PDFs. And this individual's also been told they're not necessarily good for screen readers and that kind of thing. So is that something you kind of fold into this? Yeah,
one of the core sets of the initial functional requirements document was that the files be PDF UA accessible. So that's something we're thinking about. We're very cognizant of the fact, as I said, that people abuse PDF in a lot of ways and don't follow the spec, but that's something that we're really, really hoping to avoid up front, out of the gate with it. But yeah, you can't control what other people do. So,
cool.
Unfortunately,
there is
sometimes.
one more question about the. Okay, there's one more in the room.
Hello, it's Steve Daly here from National Archives at the UK, and I'm very happy to talk about that Droid and Pronom thing around PDFs and signatures, because we do have some complications with PDF and detecting those more precisely. Just carrying on that question around format specifications, is the intention that this EA PDF, the PDF mail, is that going to be a specification about how to use existing capabilities in formats like PDF-A, how to get the best out of that, or is it another variant of PDF?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is intended to build on PDF-A. Now, when you look at the spec itself, it's going to say should comply with PDF-A. It's not going to make it a must, because there are reasons where places would not necessarily want to do that. For instance, if you don't think that the font information is important, if that's not a significant characteristic, why encode it all in there? Because then it just bloats the file, right? So yeah, it is intended to build on PDF-A. It's intended to fully.
So when you've got like PDF-A 1A, 1B, all that sort of stuff, is it another one of those, or is it?
It'll be a separate. Well, I mean, the first step it'll be a PDF mail. So it'll be a separate thing incorporating elements of PDF-A, 1 and all of that. But longer term, we're hoping to take it to ISO and have it be a separate, if I'm following your question correctly.
Yeah, and I guess the killer question, if I had an application today that could read a PDF file, a PDF-A file, for example, is it going to have a good go at reading one of these?
Oh yeah, it'll be, there's legacy compatibility there. Everything will be viewable. Now, will it be able to do things like render all of those bookmarks, or show the XML, show the EML version of the file, or make it exportable? No, that part would be the viewer application that would come later. But yeah, it'll be viewable out of the box.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay. So I think there we go. We're wrapping things up right now, but please join me in a round of applause for all of our speakers in this session. Thank you.